then Franz, would you like me to introduce you today?
Oh, yes, yes, please. You do such a nice job.
Okie dokie.
Okay, let me scoot off to the one more camera and then get back. I'll be ready to go. Ah, crap. Sorry. My fingers were too fat. Well, you know what I'll do? Let's forget the iPad, and I'll just introduce the thing, because when I went to hit the button, the holder kind of diverted my finger, and I hit leave. We'll have to leave the meeting. So we can just drop that, and I'll get my little friend over here with me.
Okay.
Yeah, probably what I'll do is kind of, again, I thought if we could get people to take a photo of it, then they could use as a reference if they wanted to draw the same thing that I'd be working with. But it's not. This isn't going to be the only thing we're going to do. But
yeah.
So it'll be just as easy to hold them up.
All right. Well, if you're ready,
Yep.
I'll start letting people in.
Yep.
All right. I'm going to hit the button. Have a good class.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Krista. I'm with Faber-Castell, and we have Franz here, who you see on your screen. He's going to go ahead and lead our session tonight, the Crossroads to Crosshatching. So he's going to be your instructor for the evening. I will be moderating, so if you have any questions, you can chat me the questions. These will not be in Franz's view, so he won't be able to see the answer to the question yourself, but I'll do the best that I can. And if I don't know the answer, I will ask Franz and he can answer you directly. So thank you everyone for joining us. And I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Franz now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for coming to our session here. We're going to be doing cross-hatching. And I thought if you wanted to work on the same image that I will be working on for part of it, we're going to be doing all sorts of stuff. But I've got my friend here, and I thought if you'd take your phone out, I think it's at about that pose, a little light. Okay, so if you want to take a photo of that, then you can use this image on your camera as a resource to draw if you are so inclined. And if you aren't happy with this little guy, then you could maybe find something else that you'd much rather draw. But this is the example that I was using. And so we'll go with him. Okay, everybody get a picture? All right, I can move it around. Okay, so probably for the rest of the time now, we'll be doing from the overhead camera, my phone. So if you'd switch to that, then we can start talking about. Yep, there we go. All right, I'm not going to talk about the economy. I want to talk about cross-hatching. And cross-hatching developed as an integral tool or method for printmaking. It's used in drawing, but I associate it more with printmaking. So if you take a dollar bill, and I chose the dollar bill because they haven't changed it. It's still more kind of monochromatic. And especially if you would have a close-up of it, you can see that actually when they print this, with the exception of the green ink, when they print the dollar bill, it's all black ink. There are no gray ink. There isn't any gradation in the ink. They just have presses that ink the plate and then roll it and print it. So any illusion that you have of like the tonality and stuff in George Washington's face is due to cross-hatching. And so if in engraving and in etching, and as I will show you in drawing, there are ways of simulating the effect of gray tones by just using black ink, right? And so I've got maybe since this is a little bit bigger, this is a linoleum block print that I did. And again, after I carved the block, you roll the whole surface up with one thin layer, consistent layer of black ink. So all of the illusion of the kind of the form and the wrinkles and all that kind of stuff, especially down in through here, is achieved by the way I carved the block, so that I have a series of parallel cuts that break down these solid black areas into maybe a thick line, a thin line, a thick line, a thin line. And so that when you look at it, unless you get, right down on top of it, but especially if this is hanging up someplace, when you look at it, your eye blends it together with the white and the black, and it becomes gray. Right. And then this is kind of an example of drawing with ink pens, which I will bring out here shortly. And I decided to do an example with this that really went overboard. So the sky and the clouds. And if you think about some of the prints, especially by somebody like Albrecht Dürer, whatever, there's a certain look to those prints that are created through the cross-hatching process. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. Okay, so let me get some paper out. If you get some paper, and I'm going to be using Faber-Castell's pit pens. And the ones that we're going to be using come in a variety of points. And each one is kind of good to be familiar with what they have. There's a smaller set, which is the one that I use most of the times, that has kind of a medium tip, a fine tip, a sharp tip, and an extra sharp tip. And then you can also get a set of 8 that has those, as well as brush pens and other things. So we'll be using a variety of these pens for what we're going to be doing today. So just to let you know.
Franz, before you get started, we had a few people that did not get a chance to snap a picture of
oh, okay, sure.
that you showed in the beginning.
Sure,
so could you show us that again really quickly, please?
Yeah. Here, let's.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to tilt them a little bit about like that. So you don't need to be obligated to draw my hands. You could be just floating it. Okay.
Okay.
This is okay. Yeah.
Photo, so you're good. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Yep. Don't want anybody to miss out on one of my odd creatures here. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do, let me take. Let's see. I've got so many pens to work with here. Let's get a couple of the thicker ones out. Okay. Now, what I'd like everybody to do is just maybe very lightly. I could just kind of very lightly sketch in, kind of like a little rectangular format in through here. And now what I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to make that just a little bit smaller here. Okay, so make it about like that. Now, if the theory is, if you have a couple lines, and again, you try to kind of keep them parallel at this point. So when you look at that, you still have all this white, and then you have this that your eye is going to start, it notices that there's a difference there. All right, so if I take this and I start putting them closer together, then you're going to start getting your eye to see this more as a continuation. And you can see it looks, okay, it's definitely lighter here, and your eye starts blending things together. And you say, oh, look, it's getting darker. And it's mainly because I am decreasing the space and slightly increasing the thickness of the line as I start to proceed across. So I'll continue that. And this is something that you could practice doing so that it just becomes natural. And for me, I'm not really thinking about, it doesn't have to be so perfect that those lines look like they've been done with a T-square and a square or something like that, a straight edge. But if you work on this, you'll get to a point where it's just second nature to be able to draw those parallel lines. So now when you look at it, it definitely starts being the progress going from, you know, a lighter area, gets a little bit darker, gets a little bit darker, gets a little bit darker. And then, you know, the ultimate thing then is that you hardly have any space between those lines, and it really gets a lot darker. And then you get to the point where it is just totally dense and black. So, you know, it's up to you to decide what kind of gradation you're going to work on, you know, how fast you go from light to dark and whatnot. All right, so whenever you do these kind of exercises, it starts making sense. You can see how it's working. Now, let's see, so that was a medium point. And the point that I use almost for everything, except for the finest detail, is this S, the sharp one, all right? And if I wanted to kind of modulate that a little bit, then you can also start going across like this. So somewhere in the mid-range, if I want to start kind of making things even more finessed, then if I do a series, and if I want to, I can come back and do some of that. So essentially what I'm doing is kind of working on the proportion of how much of the paper is coming through between this lattice work of lines that I'm creating. Now with the extra sharp one, then I have, you know, this is a line made with the extra sharp, and this is the sharp. So you can see they progressively get, excuse me, thicker. And then, let's see. So you also have the thickness of the line as something that you can work with. Now, the other thing about these particular pens, they're an India ink formulation. And so that when they dry, they're permanent. And a lot of times what I will do is a key drawing with the black line and then do cross-hatching to get some feeling for shadow and value. And then when the ink has dried long enough and becomes permanent, then I can color it with watercolor, right? So now let's go to something that's maybe a little bit more concrete rather than just, you know, kind of, and you can continue. I found that one of the ways that I got to be fairly good at cross-hatching is taking notes in school. And I found that, you know, whatever it was that I was doing, if I was doing one of my characters or something like that, that this is what helped me pay attention to what my professor was saying, because otherwise I'd be looking out the window and not paying attention. But this occupies that kind of subconscious part of my mind that does not want to be listening. So my subconscious is happy, and then I can be listening to what's happening. So this is the type of thing that I use the cross-hatching for quite a bit. You know, I'll have like a dark line, and then come back and do a lot of the shading with the cross-hatching. But so let's kind of scale it down a little bit, and you could draw a cube. Okay. And then maybe think where the shadows are, and if you're not quite sure about shadows, if you decide, let's say that, you know, this is either the sun or it's an indoor light, you just use that as a point. And then if the light comes down here, this is where it strikes the ground. And so then if you draw a line through the corner here and through there and through there, through here, and then you draw how long it is like that. So you got a point there, and a point there. So then your shadow would be here, you go to here, it's low, you get there, and then it would kind of come in through there. All right. If you have it up higher, your shadow is going to be a lot lower. All right. So if this is going to be our light source, and that's another thing that's important, is that if you kind of keep your light source consistent, you know, like when I was kind of working with my pig here, I was kind of thinking the light's essentially coming like that. So anything that's underneath, anything that would be in shadows and through there, and then also the back over and through here. So if you keep the light consistent, even if you're doing caricature rather than something realistic, it's going to help unify your feeling for the light and the shadow and everything that's happening. So if the light is over here someplace, whether it's up here, down here, the back of the box is probably going to be the darkest. So what I'm going to do is a series of kind of dense lines for the back, and maybe just kind of go over it one more time. Okay. Now, maybe I can take a slightly thinner tip. We'll go to the sharp one, and I'll go to this side. And it's turned away from the light, but not totally like this one is. And so I will have a little more white space between. And then the top, maybe I'll use the extra sharp one. It's got a thinner line altogether. And I'll kind of, as I draw this line, I'll let it fade out a little bit so the front part of the box actually doesn't have anything on it. And then I'll use, let's see, where did I put it? The brush pen. Now the brush pen, these have fixed widths so that they're consistent no matter how you draw with them. This is a brush pen. Oops, I guess maybe I'll scoot things over this way so that it shows up more. It's a brush pen, and if you look at it, it is more like a paintbrush type thing. Right? And so that with this one, as you draw, depending on the pressure, you can get it to be thick or you can get it to be thin. But it's very juicy, and so I'm going to have my shadow be the darkest. Now, the other thing that is nice about these markers, there are other markers that are solvent-based, and when you use them, they smell. You're about ready to, pass out because of the solvents in them. And they also soak through the paper, and over a period of time, they'll bleed out. With an India ink, if you're using India ink, that's not going to happen. So if I flip this over, it doesn't go through the paper. But if I were using a solvent-based pen or marker, then you'd have the image come through. And so that if you're thinking about sketchbooks and stuff, you can get a lot more out of your sketchbook if you use India ink. All right, so when you look at this now, there's a certain feeling for the mass of it because of the shadows, and the shadows and the grays are created by the crosshatching. Now, if I wanted to refine it a little bit, I could kind of come back and maybe I decide, yeah, I want there's a little bit of light that's kind of coming this way, and so I could maybe take my finer point, and so now you can kind of see that there's a bit of a highlight that's in through here, and it's a little bit darker there, and maybe kind of do the same thing here as well, that I could change that a bit as well. So kind of a rule of thumb is that wherever the light, make sure that you keep your light source consistent, and however the light is coming through, obviously the closest to the light source, the more light it gets, the less ink you'll be putting down. But again, it's just a matter of doing these lines that your eye will blend together between the space between the lines and how thick the lines are and how dense. And I find that it's actually very satisfying and a lot of fun just to kind of play around and experiment. Now, in this case, we kind of outline things, and also with my little character here, I've got the main outline. but you know, you could practice and say, all right, I want to do a shape, and I'm going to create the feeling for shadow and an edge without having an outline. So I have this kind of ellipse, kind of this egg shape that I just formed, and I didn't outline it, but wherever the line stops and starts, that determines where that edge is. And in being fairly consistent with putting there, it has like this kind of gray effect to it. Now, if I want to make that seem a little more volumetric, then I could take that same extra sharp one and curve some lines around like that and continue to build it up. And now it's starting to look like you've got a little bit of a shadow in through there. And then I could take my brush pen, come in through here like that, and actually put a shadow in there. And if it had really harsh light, you might get a real crisp. So I'm still, you know, the whole thing is that I'm using black ink. It's the same black ink in all these pens, but depending on the distribution and the pattern that I create, then it creates the illusion of different values. Right, now, akin to crosshatching is stippling, and I thought we could talk about that a little bit as well. And stippling is just a matter of building up tones with little dots. So I'm going to start off with my bigger point here. Okay, we'll start here. And so if I start putting dots in here, it's not, you know, a bright white paper anymore. Okay, so a few more around here like that. Okay. So I've kind of done a circular type thing. Now, if I'm thinking about this, turning that actually into more feeling of a sphere rather than a flat circle, I can start thinking, let's have the light come this way. And so my highlighted area is going to be more in through here. So characteristic of a sphere, as it wraps around the back away from the light, it's going to get darker. And as it kind of comes up to where it is, you know, it's going to be lighter here. So the highlight's going to be here. So the more dots that I put, the closer together they are, the bigger they are, the darker your eye blends that together as a shade. And this is the way that, if you think of the way a black and white photograph is reproduced in like a newspaper, if you get a magnifying glass or if you look really close, you see that there are these halftone dots. Those dots vary in size and be small dots, big dots, but essentially the bigger the dot and the denser, the darker it is. The smaller the dot and more space around it, the lighter it is. Okay, so I think you can start to see the way that that becomes, it's getting much more volumetric. And again, it's because I'm creating the illusion that there's a gray here because your eye is blending the white space around the dots with the dots themselves. So if I keep on making that really dense at the bottom, and keep this really light, then it really gives a sense of it being more a sphere rather than outlining something and saying it's a flat circle. So there's quite a big a difference in your perception of those two things. And it's up to you to decide whatever composition, whatever drawing you're going to do, you know, which way do you want to go? We are having a conversation right before we came on about, you know, making art and all that. And I think it's a good idea for everybody to think about what they want to do. What do you want to do? And then, you know, we can show you techniques on how to do different things, but this technique can be used for something that's realistic. It can be used for something that is abstract. It can be used for all sorts of different applications. And what's important is for you to kind of figure out what direction do you want to take this. Okay, so we can, you know, say that Oh, another thing, the paper that you're using, I happen to be using a Stonehenge. It's made by Legion paper. It's a paper that is 100% cotton. This is a lightweight, but absorbs the ink well, holds lines well, and it's archival. It's a really nice paper. So, you want to use good markers, good pens. You want to use good paper so that you're not struggling and fighting the material. So let's see. Oh, I already knocked it down here on the clipboard here. All right. So this is our little friend. Excuse me. It's our little friend, and I thought that I would do a quick graphite drawing to kind of show where my interpretation of the values are. So let's put them next door. It's a little bit smaller than life size, but I think I took an angle that was about like that. I had the light coming from this side. So I drew it out. I used graphite in order to try to get the different blends and the different feeling for that in a more sculptural way. And I thought it might be, excuse me, I have something in my throat here. I thought it'd be helpful, perhaps, if I would put a piece of tracing paper on top of the drawing so that I could show the way I might interpret these continuous tones in ink with crosshatching. Okay, so. And I usually, if I ever doing something like this, I'll tape it down so things don't move. All right, so there's some obvious things. The black. I mean, if you want to start with something that, okay, I've got that. I know for sure what I'm doing with this. And even with these black eyes, there may be a little bit of a reflection there. So instead of, what I'll do is come in, and I know for sure that this is solid, and this is really dark in here. But as it comes around, it gets just a little bit lighter. And over here, it's kind of like the same thing. Okay, so already kind of combined with the graphite underneath, it kind of makes, gives them a certain personality. All right, now there's a little bit of a highlight that I see that's in up there. So what I'm going to do is take my S marker. It's like a, and I'm going to keep just a little bit of highlight, and I've left a little bit of space. I don't know how much of this is coming through on the camera, but I can hold it up and when we're a little closer to wall. But it just has a hint of a highlight, because in crosshatching, I ended up putting, with a finer point, I put some lines together that would be a contrast to the solid black. All right, now when I come up here, I notice that this is pretty solid black again, up and through here. It's a shadow. But as it comes up to the top, it's a little bit lighter. So I'm going to bring it down like that. And then there's really a dark line that kind of comes all the way around here up until about here. And then it goes on, instead of actually being on the eye, it's on the outside, and they kind of join together. All right. Now, at this point, I've noticed that I've got a very fine line in through here, so I'm going to just put that in, like with this one. And there's just a tiny bit of a hint in through there. Okay, so now we've got the beginning of our value here. So I noticed that, the way that I sketched this out, there's a really dark gray in through here. So I can start to Now, what I want to do, what I have forgotten to mention, and let's get our little scratch pad out here again. Whenever you have something flat, then you can pretty much count on being able to draw these straight lines. But let's say that you've got, well, like a log here, or a cylinder of some kind. Instead of using straight lines, I want the lines to describe the surface. And so if instead I start doing curved lines that are characteristic of the volume of this thing. I don't want it to be a flat looking thing. I want it to have some volume. So my crosshatched lines will follow the direction of the surface. And if I want to make that a little bit darker, then I can put shorter lines in between the lines that I've already put in there. And just characteristic of round things. A lot of times what will happen is, like, if I've got a sphere and I'll put the shading in through here, but there's a little bit of light that comes down here and it bounces up and it reflects at the very kind of bottom part of that sphere. So it might be fairly dark in through here, and then it's kind of dark way at the bottom. But a lot of times you get this little hint of a light highlight. It's not like maybe a real bright, blind you in the eye white highlight, but it's a little bit lighter in through here because that curved surface is absorbing the light that's hitting the table surface and is reflected on that part. So that in through here, if I want to do a similar feeling for it, then I might make this a lot darker up in through here, and maybe just a tiny bit here, but you can kind of leave just a little inference that there's a highlight in through there. And then as I go around the top of that, I'll use maybe my thinner point, and so that's going to be a lighter gray when it blends together. And then I might just put a little bit of indications here so that my highlight is up here at the top. Okay, so I'm going to try to use that type of thing when I am working on my PAL here. So I'm following, when I look at it, and if I look at the model itself, there's an indentation here. So that isn't on the same surface as the forehead in through there. It's almost like, if this were clay and you take the end of my pen, it's been pushed down there a little bit. So there's kind of like a hollow there, and with the light hitting it, then there's a bit of a shadow that is in there. All right, come across like that. And it's a little bit deeper at the bottom, but see, as I come here now, I'm curving it to this direction, and I'm anticipating that this is how it's curved. Now with this, it's up here and it goes down in there. So I have a tendency to want to make all this stuff kind of curve into it. So you can see the way it's starting to look a little more of a volume. Okay, so let's come up to the forehead here. And again, I want to try to develop a feeling for that shape. So the shape of my lines is going to change a little bit. But as I come up to the forehead, then it's going to get a little bit lighter. Now in through here, I don't know if you can see it, but I've got some highlights. And so that when I'm coming in through here, wherever I have the edge, I'm going to just kind of let that break my edge. And so I've kind of created the highlight there by not drawing over it. All right, so we can kind of do the same thing over here to start balancing it out. So it's fairly dark here. And that lightens up a little bit. It's still kind of a curved shape that's a little bit in the shadows, but okay. And through here, I've got kind of a nostril shape, another one here. But then the end of the nose, I've got a little bit of a highlight just at the top of that nostril. A little darker shadow in through here as it comes around. So this could be a lot darker. Okay, got a bit of a highlight. Okay, now this seems to be really dark. And this is really dark. But the tongue itself is more kind of like a light gray. And a little bit in here like that. Okay, so you can, there's a little bit of a smile there. And there's a bit of a highlight that is around it. So, but then it gets a little bit lighter as it comes around there. And you know, a lot of times I may not get it the first time, but it's really kind of, it's like working out this puzzle. And a lot of it has to do with the contrast that you can develop. So if you want an edge to pop out, then have something dark up against a light. If you want it to be more gradual transition, then you kind of work these lines out. And again, if I think it needs to be a little bit darker yet, I can kind of come in through here and put some that would go in another direction. Okay, so maybe what we can do is, let me put a piece of paper behind that and I can kind of see the way that it's evolving. Okay. So, you know, with some more work, I could get, maybe I will do that. Let's just get a little more of it done and then we'll move on to the next thing. Because I think that this is, you know, primarily just kind of getting used to the way that this works and practice and figure things out for yourself. Okay, so we got a little more of a shadow there.
Question, when you're cross-hatching, is it important to keep the lines in the same direction?
Well, I mean, I rotate them. I mean, I think that if I'm trying to develop more of a flat surface or something like that, then yeah, I'm going to keep it like that. Now, I mean, you could, I mean, there's a way, if you wanted to, you could kind of do a whole bunch of little kind of squiggles. And then if you have an area that you want to be a little darker, then just go over that area a little bit more. So, I mean, you don't necessarily have to use straight lines, but, you know, you want to be somewhat consistent with what your lighting source is like. I find that, you know, if you look at engravings and the type of stuff I do, I have a tendency to always keep my lines fairly parallel, but they may be curved if it's on a curved surface. But, you know, in something like this, if I decided that, yeah, if I start coming across here a little bit and there like that, then you're starting to develop a flat pattern. So if you think about, let's say that you think about a flannel shirt, okay? So if you would take the cloth, let me get a bigger pen so it might show up a little better. If you think about the cloth, a flannel cloth, I'll turn that off so that, okay. So, you know, the lines that make up, you know, you've got some interwoven stuff. So let's say if that's one color, and then next to it, you might have the solid block that's just all one color, and then, you know, another solid color here, and here, and then you come back with another So this creates, if you take that cloth, let's say before it's made into the shirt, and you put it down on the table, it's very geometric. But then once it's been made into a shirt, and let's say you're looking at somebody's arm and the sleeve, and the person's hand, you know, it's going to be in through here. Then instead of having a pattern like that, it's going to be following the curve of your arm. It's a gigantic pattern here. So then, you know, you'd have the, and so then these would be like that. So this is going to give you a much better feeling for the arm. So that when you're cross hatching, it's the same thing that, you know, it kind of, if you have, you know, some kind of a shape, I'll just make some kind of goofy shape here. Then as I'm doing the cross hatching, I want to start thinking, okay, well, let's see. So I keep them as if they were parallel, but they're also following the form. You know, so like in perspective, if you have like a 2-point perspective, you know, you've got the horizon line, vanishing point, going through here. You know, you got the straight lines that come in through here. But then, you know, as you find other things, these lines aren't parallel anymore in the sense that it's the same distance from here to here, from there to there. It's a perceived sameness because of this mathematical visual system you've created, right? So then when you look at that and you look at that in perspective, those are parallel lines, but in the real world, those are lines that intersect, you know, off to that point. So it's the same thing here, that even though these are curved lines and they change a little bit, they still represent an orderly fashion that give you the feeling that that is what parallel lines would look like on a curved surface. I don't know if that makes anything clear or not. So, but again, you know, on this, if we're looking at this again, I could be creating a certain sense of the volume of this odd shape, but I could just as well come back maybe with this, and if I want to get some more shading in there, you know, I don't necessarily have to use parallel lines. It's just like the more little squiggles I do here, you know, kind of the darker it gets. And so that's really starting to have kind of a nice feel for, you know, a volume. And then maybe as it comes up, and it could be that, you know, a texture like that could be a little more interesting, be a little more fast, but you can mix and match. And, you know, there isn't specifically, I mean, there's just no right way of doing it unless you have a very specific look you're going after. So if you're going after the engraved George Washington look, then yes, by all means, be very meticulous. But this is kind of fun to see if you can have this kind of rigid organic shape and then use these little squiggly lines here. So, you know, some people may say, well, it isn't purest cross-hatching, but it's, you know, essentially it's the same theory. It's the idea that in dealing with the proportion between the marks you make and the paper in between and how big the marks are, you know, you're developing a sense of value that will build up form dependent on a system of marks that you're putting together. Now, it might be a little bit more confusing, though, that if you have a shape, again, let's do another volumetric thing. Let's have another blobby shape. Okay, so whatever that is. All right. So if I take one of these approaches, whether it's like very carefully putting together evenly spaced and the same thickness of lines, that's going to have a certain effect. All right. And then I could come back and maybe take a slightly smaller line one and continue those a little bit more so they kind of taper off. I'm still trying to be very meticulous about the way I'm doing that. And then I could even maybe kind of come through with a line, but see, I'm following that curve again. I'm following the surface that I'm trying to kind of help describe with these lines. So that's starting to build, you know, a feeling for some kind of volume. Now, we've talked about then, you know, someplace else you could get involved with trying to get little squiggly lines to kind of help give you a feeling for what the form is. The more I go over it, the more of the paper I'm covering up, so the darker it's getting. And then if I want to kind of lighten it out, as if the light is hitting there, and then as it goes around, as the curve gets darker, I just keep on adding to it and adding to it. So that works too. And, you know, even the two together are kind of interesting. But probably is not going to work as well is if you contradict the shape. So if I'm going like this, and then I decide I want to do that, and then I do that, this is going to be seen more as texture or a pattern, and it's going to flatten things, whereas this approach is going to give you more of a feeling for volume and shadow and shape and things. So, yeah, practice both ways. I mean, like I said, there isn't necessarily, you know, the cross-hatching police aren't going to haul you off to jail if you try something like that. There are traditional ways of doing it that are a little more controlled, like the way that an engraver would, or, you know, you have this kind of way. You have a combination where maybe you have some thicker lines and then you've got these little thin, delicate, squiggly lines, and, you know, that could give you something quite nice. So, you know, as I develop the drawing, you know, I could continue to, you know, do the lines and try to get the light tones, the dark tones. But in the case that I'm working on here, I'm trying to follow the surface in kind of a systematic way so that it looks a little tighter. But, you know, as we were working with that other thing, you know, here, instead of doing this, you know, maybe this is the way to do it. You know, I know that I got a darker shadow in through here, and I got a little bit of a highlight there. So let's kind of work on it like this a little bit. So I might find that, hey, you know, actually this is kind of more suitable to do it this way, or maybe have a combination of the two or something. I mean, just, that's the fun of it, that it's your exploration, you're testing things out, you're seeing what works. You have a chance to play with it a little bit to find out, well, yeah, that could work really well, but is it what I want? I don't know. Let's do some more and find out. So play with it, see what you come up with, practice on things like this. Now, what I was talking about earlier too was, yeah, the characters, a lot of times that I do when I do the illustrations for like kid books or, you know, whatever I'm doing, we'll use the brush pen because it has a lot of energy in the line that I'm making there. With these fixed points, you know, it's the same thickness and relative darkness from start to finish, but with the brush pens, and they actually have one that is even nicer. This one is what's called a soft brush pen, and this one is even more like a paintbrush. And what I like about this is that it transfers the energy of your drawing pressure. So if I finish this and I come across like that, I come like that. You know, it goes thick to thin. A lot of times if you're working with an organic shape, if you start off and let's say you're doing a shoulder, if you bear down on it and then lighten up a little bit, excuse me, the swell that goes from thin to thick to thin kind of gives you a reference, or it kind of suggests that I just did something that curves. Whereas if you have a line that would come down and go across and comes down, you still might have a sense, okay, it's organic, but this gives you kind of like a intimation that it actually curves around the back where you can't see it, where this looks more like it's a single geometric line that is on a flat piece of paper. So it kind of depends on what it is that you want to do, what kind of effect you want. So let's go back with a soft brush here with my little character. We'll have him, he was following the class. He's making his little blobby things too. Okay, so I like the look of that brush. It's very immediate, and so now if I want to give it a little more dimension or form, then I can start coming in. And this is, like I said, this is one of my favorite things to do. I like then coming in with a more kind of refined cross-hatching line. It isn't quite as fluid and brush strokey. But, this is like a organic shape. So instead of using straight lines, but, they curve a little bit as they get a little closer to the end. I'm trying to define the shape by the way I draw. Okay, so this is like kind of a rounded cheek here. Can put a little bit of that. Now, as I mentioned, this Indie ink, once it dries, it's permanent. But sometimes, depending on how thickly you put it on, the brush pen lays down quite a bit of ink. So it may take, 5, 10, 15 minutes for that to permanently set up. But we're going to pretend that, I can also do a little stippling. And for me, that just is, I can't think of anything more fabulous than just horsing around with your pen. At a certain point, too, I found that, if I have something that I really want to get, have total control over, I might do a little pencil sketch first. But I found that there's a real kind of interesting that happens when you just dive right in without doing any preliminary sketches, and you just do it. And as long as you have enough paper, I mean, if it doesn't work out, well, you draw another one. But there's a certain fluidity and kind of a nice energy that happens when you just go for it. Okay, so. All right, so let's let that dry for just a second, and I'm going to get my set of watercolors over here. And assuming that that has set up, I'm sure it hasn't, but we'll pretend that it has. Then I can kind of come through in through here, and then reinforce. Yeah, actually, it's not bleeding too much. Problem is that if this is kind of wet and it lingers too long in the black line, since it hasn't totally set up yet, there's a chance that it might kind of sully the color. And so you can apply the watercolor to kind of work with your cross hatching. So you have kind of this nice immediacy with the ink lines, and then come in with some cross hatching. And then you can kind of reinforce the form and the whole look to it by adding watercolor or color pencil or something like that. Okay. So it's a little bit darker here, a little bit lighter there. Again, maybe thinking about the light coming this way. And then maybe for, you know, the eyes, put a little shadow in here, a little in here. And I kind of like, you know, using blue every once in a while for, you know, sometimes it grays it out a little bit, but it kind of is very nice as a shadow. Put that down into like that. You can get, let's give them some really nice glowing ears. Put some fluorescent color in there. A little blue shadow down here. This trotter is kind of a darker blue. Some more shadow in through here. So once you get, you know, your key line in there, once you get some cross hatching in, then you could come back with pencil or watercolor, some color pit pens, brush pens, or something like that. And you know, it has a very nice effect, I think, what you can do. Does anybody have any questions, or is there part of the topic that you want amplified? Or we've got a couple minutes left, so if you have any questions. I mean, I get totally lost in doing these drawings. And I have found that the combination of the black line and then with watercolor really suits my imagination. I guess would be a way of putting it. So, but you know, as you know, I mentioned, you can use cross hatching for very practical reasons. I'm not encouraging anybody to start forging, but you know, this is just so controlled, and you look at all the patterns and stuff. But if you look at that, you know, especially if you have a magnifier, they're individual lines, and the thing that makes you feel like you've got gray tones is because they're very fine lines with white space around them. And then for the darker tones, if you look at it, there are a whole lot more lines and they're closer together. You know, you can interpret things like I was starting to do with, you know, look at the tones of the drawing and then decide that, well, let's break it down more in terms of textures or lines or the cross hatching. And then, again, as I keep on saying, my favorite thing is just to go at it and, you know, think of something I want to draw and draw it with a nice fluid line, go back and get some cross hatching in there, and then when it dries up and the ink is set, then go back with some more watercolor and you know, really kind of make it pop out. Okay, again, any questions? I think that's pretty much what I've got to show you today. It can be a lot of fun, especially as I said, if you know, go ahead and get the tools that are going to make it obvious when you're working, whether, you know, did you make a mistake or was it bad materials? Well, you know, if you start off with good materials, then you'll know that maybe you have to work at something or you'll have success. You're more apt to have success with good materials. So, you know, treat yourself. You're putting a lot of time and you want to put a lot of effort into your work. You should be proud of it. So, you know, don't fight the materials. Get materials that will help you go beyond anything you ever thought you could do. Okay, well, thank everybody for coming. And yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
You did a great job. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed the class.
Good night, everybody. Have fun.